So, 300 years ago, there was a young English clergyman by the name of John Wesley. He was the son of another English pastor, Samuel Wesley, and his grandfather was also a clergyman, a Puritan in England at a time of great national upheaval when they had the English Civil War back in the 1600s. That's more history than you want to know about today. But John Wesley lived in a time when England was ripe for spiritual revival, for renewal. The nation was probably at an ebb as far as faith was concerned. People were nominally religious. They kind of considered themselves to be Christian because they were English, they were Christian, they were baptized as a baby. That meant that they were a Christian. And Wesley reached a place in his life where he looked around and he didn't see any difference between those who claimed to be Christians and how they lived. And he came to this conclusion that there was something different. There was something that God wanted from His people, and that was holiness. And that holiness to be set apart, to be different. But the interesting thing about John Wesley was that even though he had such strong convictions, was that he didn't have an assurance in his own heart that he was accepted by God. In other words, he was afraid of death because he was afraid that if he died, he wasn't sure where he would be when he woke up. He didn't have assurance of his salvation. And so when he came to this conviction about holiness, Wesley gathered some of his friends. He had 4 or 5 friends when he was at school at Oxford in England. And they started a group, they started a club, and they called themselves the Holy Club. Okay? Automatically you're kind of turned off by that name, like the holier than thou club. It sounds like these weird, exclusive, uppity kind of people. And that's exactly the way they were perceived and probably the way they acted. They were given a derisive name. People made fun of them. They called them the Methodists because they always had a method, and it was a way of making fun of them, and the name wound up sticking. And it was John Wesley, it was his brother Charles, and George Whitefield, who wound up coming to America and becoming one of the great preachers in early America. And these group of guys, they met every week, and they had strict rules on. They prayed at certain times a day. They fasted twice a week. They visited the prisons. They gave a certain percentage of their income. Okay, and they were pursuing holiness together. But even though John Wesley did this, and he and his friends, they rigorously pursued the holy life, they didn't, or John, at least John Wesley, still didn't have an assurance of his salvation. There was something that was missing. As hard as he was striving, there was something he was missing. And Wesley decided, like in his restlessness of soul, he decided to take a trip to Georgia. Okay, this was before the days where you could just hop a flight and go to Georgia. They crossed the Atlantic on a ship to be a missionary to the Indians, and he was hoping by preaching to the Indians, he himself would be saved, which doesn't sound like that would work out very well, and it didn't work out very well. But on the way to Georgia, John Wesley was on a ship, and the ship encountered a storm. And Wesley was certain that he was going to die, and not only he himself, but everybody else on that ship, they were screaming in terror in the midst of the storm. But there was one group of people, and they actually weren't English. They were from Germany. They were Moravians who came from a Christian community there in Moravia. And in the midst of the storm, he noticed how calm they were. And they were singing songs. They were singing hymns, praise to God, and weren't afraid. And so when the storm was over, Wesley asked them, he said, "How come you were so calm in the storm? How can you how are you not afraid to die?" And they said, "We have faith in Jesus. We know Jesus. We don't have any reason to fear death." And Wesley knew then that he had at least seen what he needed but didn't have. Faith. Faith in Jesus. And so he sought after it. The excursion to Georgia failed. He went back to England. In 1738, at a meeting at Aldersgate Street in England, while someone was reading what the reformer Martin Luther had written on the letter to the Romans, reading his commentary, he had a moment where suddenly it hit him. And he realized, or he had an experience with God, where he's described, he says, "I felt my heart was strangely warmed, And I knew that Jesus died for my sins and even mine. And He had saved me from the law of sin and death. He had that assurance. He had that moment. He knew he was a child of God. He knew he was a citizen of heaven. He knew he didn't have to fear death. And he didn't. And what happened was that a great revival started. Wesley began to preach out into the fields, and people, thousands upon thousands, were converted under his ministry. And a Methodist revival began in England that wound up spreading to America. But it was interesting. Those who responded to Wesley's preaching, those who heard it, those who were saved under his ministry, they weren't the elite, okay? They weren't the respected people of society. In fact, Wesley was thrown out of churches in England. A lot of the Anglican churches, they wouldn't let Wesley preach there. It was the common people. It was the coal miners. It was blue collar, the working class. They received the message of the gospel through Wesley and his Methodist preachers, and they were changed. And not just they were changed, the whole nation was changed. Wesley saw that his purpose, he described it this way. He says, the reason I believe that, and this was 300 years ago, again, this was many years ago, but he said, the reason I believe God raised up the Methodists, not that we're supposed to be any different than any normal Christian, okay, but the reason that this revival happened was to spread scriptural holiness over the land. That holiness that's revealed in the Bible, in the Scriptures, and to bring reformation to the nation and to the church. And it happened. The temperance movement, this was within a few decades after Wesley had died, the temperance movement began to gain steam in the United Kingdom and in the United States, okay, which was really the opposition to alcohol, which there wound up being like an amendment to the Constitution. Some people have different opinions about that, and we look back on those days, but that was birthed in this idea of holiness of heart and life. The abolition of slavery in England in the early 1800s. The Methodist revival had a great influence on this. People looked at it and said, these slaves, what's being done to them is wrong. And they were convicted based on Christian convictions. And so there was a change. And those who are of the working class, their lives were changed. And in fact, their place in society was changed. Because instead of abusing alcohol, instead of getting drunk, instead of beating their wives, abusing their families, they started managing their money better. They started living by Christian principles. And their status in society was elevated. And so in response to this, Wesley preached a sermon on money. Wesley preached a lot of sermons throughout his life, but he had 52 sermons that he went back to over and over again. And the sermons are titled things like Salvation by Faith and the Almost Christian, very powerful. In Wesley's preaching, in churches, people came under conviction. There were people crying out in the middle of the services, falling out, coming up, praying at a bench. I mean, it was like the most intense revival you can imagine. That was what happened when he preached. People experienced the power of God. But they also got practical advice on how to live. And it's in the 50th sermon of those 52, which are still supposed to be standard doctrine for the Methodist Church. Wesley talks about the use of money. And he has 3 points. 3 points on the use of money. And they are gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. And these 3 points on money are going to form the foundation of the series that's going to last for 3 weeks, starting today. And so today, we look at the first of these. And you don't have to tell me, I know it's your favorite. Yeah. You can say, give all you can. That's my favorite. It's better to give than to receive, and you'd be lying. I know you. Because, I'm saying, we love to gain. Gain all you can. Now, I actually, in going back and looking at this and preparing for this series, I didn't exactly remember this correctly. I thought it was earn all you can, okay? Because that's the way we like to couch it, earn all you can. But that's not what Wesley said. That's not the words of his sermon. They were gain all you can. And you think about it, I mean, we work to earn a living, and no question about it, there are expectations of us, and we have to work and earn a living. But so much of what we got, we didn't really earn. It was given to us. Gain all you can. Now, I bet you probably can count on one hand the number of sermons that you've heard on gain all you can. Gain as much money as you can. And some of you are like, I'm really glad I came to church today. You know, this is really good. And you'd be skeptical about that. You'd be skeptical because you're waiting for the punchline, right? Now, here's a number, call this number and give us your credit card number. And that's how we know you're going to gain all you can. You give me your money and God's going to bless you. You know, that's a lot of approach of a lot of pastors. And not really, but you see them on TV and you've heard the reputation of those who are like that. And that even in your giving, that the goal should be gaining. I think it's better definitely to give than not to give. But let's just be honest. Let's be honest that, okay, it's not bad, not wrong to gain. Money is not evil. But there is a skepticism that comes with this kind of message for good reason. And it's the reason that Paul talks about in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10. You may have heard this verse before. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Now notice he doesn't say money is a root of all kinds of evil. And it doesn't say the root of all evil. Some people say it's all evil. No, it's the love of money. It's the love of it. The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, that you would love it and desire it, and it begins to take priority over other things. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. The desire for money, or the desire for what money can give, the security that money can give, has led people to compromise on their values, to compromise on their principles in pursuit of safety or what money can give. And as a result, they wander from the faith. I mean, that's been happening for centuries. It was happening in the days that Paul wrote this. And it's true that the love of money, or the desire to accumulate or to gain more of it, can lead us astray. One time in my life, this was about 10 years ago, this was in about 2010, it was right after the financial crisis of 2008, and I have an aunt who lived at the beach, lived on Walton County, Florida, and like I was saving money ready to buy a house. I was making some investments, and at that time the stock market was doing well after it like crashed, and so I was thinking about buying a place at the beach, okay? And here, I hadn't bought a house, for one thing, and people were like, oh, you're going to make so much money. The market's depressed, and it's a great time to buy. And so I went down and looked at some places to buy down at the beach. And here I am, a single pastor, 33 years old, and I think, kind of restless in my life. Maybe in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, if I got a place at the beach, that'll be a lot easier to get dates. I mean, hey. But probably thinking that in the back of my mind. And I was reading in my devotional time, and this verse spoke to me, okay? Verse 9. Because I was buying it to get rich. Not just like to have a place, because I maybe might want that at some time in my life, maybe. But at that time, I wasn't even a homeowner. And this verse just hit me right between the eyes. It says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. That's the verse right before the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And I thought, this might be a fine thing for another time of life, and if I had more income than I have, and I was saving at that time, but I'm a pastor, and some people their job is real estate, and that's great. That's the way you make a living, but that's not the way I'm making a living. This is just me trying to get rich. And so I didn't do it. And I'm glad, because that would have been a lot more responsibility that I needed at that moment in my life. Beware the dangers of the desire for money. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, it says the same thing. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Okay? Don't look to money to give you what only God can give you: security, meaning, significance. God said, I'm never going to leave you, I'll never forsake you. Look to God to provide. And so there's the danger of the love of money. But money is not all bad. And gaining money is not all bad. In fact, Jesus, as much as he talked about money, he talked about it a lot. He talked about the danger of greed. And he talked about the god of mammon, which is the god of wealth, taking the place of the true, the living God. He also told a parable, which is a story with a deeper meaning, that had main characters in it whose job was to make money. And that was seen as a good thing. In fact, this parable is known as the parable of the talents. Now, if you have the New International Version, they came out with a new version of the New International Version instead of the old New International Version. But it's the New International Version, so I preach from the new one instead of the old new one. But in case you're confused, the old new one, it calls it the parable of the talents. The new one calls it the parable of the bags of gold. Because you think of a talent, well, you think of like American Idol, you think of something like that, or America's Got Talent, or whatever the show is. And it's not talking about that. In Jesus' day, a talent was a unit of money. It was actually a unit of weight first, and it came to represent a certain amount of money. Just like pounds sterling, which is the British standard of money. Now it doesn't mean pounds of sterling silver anymore, anything like that. It's just come to have its own. A pound is a certain amount of money. Well, a talent was a certain amount of money in Jesus' day. And so Jesus tells this parable, this story, that's a figurative story about someone who has a great amount of wealth, and to give a greater picture of a deeper spiritual truth. We're told in Matthew chapter 25, verse 14, he starts it off. He says, talking about the kingdom of heaven, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. A very wealthy man who goes on a long journey and entrusts what he has to his servants. Maybe steward would be a better term than servant. And this is how he distributes it. He distributes his wealth in this way. He doesn't give all of it. He doesn't distribute it equally. In fact, we're told that he gave to them according to their ability. To one steward, to one servant, he gives 5 talents. Now realize a talent would be worth about 20 years' wages in Jesus' day. A lot of money. I was just trying to think of a figure we could relate to. Maybe $1 million today. The master entrusted $5 million to one servant, $2 million to another servant, $1 million to a third. Now, the one with $1 million might say he got gypped, but he still got $1 million. Okay? And here's what happens. It says, those with the 5 talents went out, and he took what his master had entrusted with him, and he invested. And he worked with that money, and he made 5 more. And the one who had 2 talents did the same thing, and we're told that he gained 2 more. But the one with the 1 talent, he took his money and he dug a hole and he buried it in the ground. Okay? For the thought that when disaster comes, I'll have this talent in the ground. At least I have with my master. When he comes back, I'll just be able to give back to him what's his and say, here, it's yours. Well, the master comes back after being away for a long time. And when he comes back, as would be expected, he asks his servants how they did with what he'd entrusted to them. And the one with 5 talents comes first. He says, the man who had received 5 talents, this is verse 20, brought the other 5. Hey, I got the 5 you gave me, and guess what? I made 5 more. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have gained 5 more. There's that word gained. He didn't say I earned 5 more. He probably got it through some very shrewd trading, perhaps. Perhaps he made some investments. I mean, if you invest in something and it grows, have you really earned it? I mean, you gained it. You made maybe a wise investment in that sense. But he gained 5 more. And the master is very pleased with this, as it would be expected. After all, you took what was mine, and you were a good manager, you were a good steward, and not only that, but you took it and it grew. You gained more. His response to him is, well done, good and faithful servant. You didn't just have your interest in mind, you had my interest in mind, and you knew that I would be pleased with this growing amount of wealth. You've been faithful with a few things, I will put you in charge of many things. You've demonstrated your faithfulness, and I'm going to not only give you this, I'm going to share my happiness with you. And here we get to like there's a kind of a bigger spiritual picture here Jesus is pointing at. Well, the one with 2 talents says, you only gave me 2, but I doubled it. I made 2 more. So now I got 4. And he gives it to his master. And the master, we see his response to this servant is the exact same. He's not more happy with the one who made 5 than the one who made 2. He gives them the equal reward. His response is the exact same. You are faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. You've proved your faithfulness with a little, and now I'm going to put you in charge of more. This is true on so many levels of life. But then the third servant comes. And his response is different than the other 2. Because instead of having a perspective of a master who's generous, who is in favor of risk-taking, who sort of takes advantage of like the limited time and the limited resource, just takes advantage of what you have versus what you don't have. The man, he says, Master, I knew that you are a hard man, which is an interesting response. The other 2 seem to have a perspective of a gracious master who's willing to take risks. This one is, I know you just can't wait to punish me. That you're harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. I didn't want to mess up. I didn't want to mess anything up. And here's what happened. So at least this is what he says. In verse 25, he says, I was afraid. And I went out and I hid it in the ground. And here is what belongs to you. Really, I mean, it's just kind of an excuse for doing nothing. And the master, of course, perceives that. And here's his response. He is not pleased. And he says so. You wicked, lazy servant. There's the hint of laziness. So you knew that I harvest where I haven't sown and gather where I have not scattered seed? Instead of like the opposite of being faithful with a few things, I'll put you in charge of many things. You haven't been faithful in what the little thing I gave you, and so I'm going to even take that away from you. Verse 28, take that talent and give it to the one who has 10. Now that seems unfair, but the master wants to have his resources used to get the best use out of them. So he gives to the one who's been the most faithful, or who has gained the most. Now, there's lots of things we could take from this parable. But I think we can take this at least. And that is that in this case, of course, the master represents God, the stewards, the servants represent all of us. But each one was held accountable for what they did with their master's resources. In this case, the master's money. It was his money. And he held them accountable for what they did with it. And what we observed is that those who gained were commended. They were commended. And the reason they were commended was because they invested, they gained more, and they had a perspective of for whom it was intended. Those who gained were commended. They remembered for whom it was intended. They weren't afraid to take risks. They had a vision of a master who was a gracious master, who was a wealthy master, who would reward risk-taking and seeking to make a profit or to gain from what they had been entrusted with. And so I think there's a lesson here. There's a lesson here for us when it comes to managing our money. And I think we see the perspective here in these servants. Okay? They weren't afraid to make risks, to take risks, to make investments, because they knew their master. And they didn't base their identity on what the master had given to them. You see, you will manage money. You will manage the money that belongs to you according to your bank account, okay, the name in your bank account. You will manage it better when it's not the most important thing in your life. When you depend upon money to give you an identity, to give you status, when your whole life is based around how much you have, and what happens if you take a risk, okay, and it fails, it doesn't work out, is your life over? Does that mean that you should end your life? Because a lot of people do that when it's the most important thing in your life. It takes the pressure off. This is not a zero-sum game, okay? Because it's not your money. It's God's money. It's God's. Say that with me. It's God's money. Now, don't you just automatically feel free? Some of you, it's very hard for you to say that. You're like, Let's say it. So let's say it again. It's God's money. It's God's money. That's the most freeing thing. What we've been entrusted to. It might have our name on the account, but it's God's. God has loaned it to us for a time. We will be held responsible according to what we have done with it. And so this perspective that it's God's, that we are stewards of what God has given to us, it affects how we go about gaining it. Now that we know about gaining, that is not wrong, okay? That, in fact, the master commends those who take what they have and invest and gain. But remembering that it's God's affects how we gain it or how we seek to gain it. And so I have these questions to ask about how you gain it, okay? To think about. And the first is this. Do you seek to gain at the expense of your well-being? Do you seek to gain at the expense of your well-being? Do you seek to gain at the expense of your health? Are you overworked? Is what you do for a living good for your soul? Okay? Is the work environment that you are in, is it a good environment for you? Now, it may be that what you're doing and where you are is that you are a light in a place that maybe there's not a lot of light. But the question is, are you being that light? And is what you are doing, if it's not good for your well-being, are you looking for something else? Okay? Because making money is good and fine, but not if it robs us of the most important things in our life. If it robs us of health, if it robs us with time that beyond what would be expected of time with loved ones, that's needed time with family, do you gain at the expense of your well-being? Secondly, do you seek to gain at the expense of others' well-being? Now, this is a tricky question, okay? Do you gain at the expense of others' well-being? Do you gain by exploiting the bad habits of other people? By taking advantage of destructive behaviors on their part, okay? And this can get kind of gray areas. But the first thing I think about is predatory lending. Taking advantage of someone because either they don't know that that's a terrible way to spend their money, or they're in such a desperate place. There's reasons why the Scriptures speak so profoundly and powerfully about that. Gambling is another one, okay? Now, really, there's a gray area here, and it comes down to where anything can be destructive. I mean, I've known people who are addicted to buying like porcelain dolls, okay? And like, not like in a sadistic way, like someone who like, you go to their house and it's like, this was someone who was actually committed a crime against my former employer several years ago, and they stole money and used it to buy thousands of dolls. So I don't believe it's immoral to make dolls, you know? I don't think that is, but like soap. People can be like buying way too much, they can be addicted to those kind of things. Okay? And in my experience is that small business owners and people who start a business, they're some of the most generous people because they work and they invest to make something great, to make a difference, to do something. And in the process, there's jobs and all this these are good things. But there are industries that profit off the destructive behaviors of people. In the media, there are entities that profit off destructive behavior. In the food and beverage industry, in the medical industry, praise God for medicine, but there could be an abusive in gambling. And I know that the casino does a lot of good for our community. And there's the little sign up there that says, you got a gambling problem, call this number. And you might be able to go there and bet a little bit and leave, and you've had a little fun, you spent $50 or whatever. But there's a lot of people that's not the case for. They come to see us and ask for help. And let me tell you, the casino ain't giving it back. Oh, well, you had a hard time. They ain't going to give it back. They're profiting. They're exploiting off the behavior of others, okay? Now, I know I go on the meddling here, but you have to think about all the good that's able to be done. Is it worth it? Now, I know that you can't like check to see if everything you bought, whether it was made in a sweatshop, and somebody was paid, you can't know. It's a complex economy that we live in. But for me, when I make investments, and I'm invested, I have a church retirement, and I also have a personal IRA, a Roth IRA that I started about 10 years ago, and I oversee, have a great deal of say in what is invested, what mutual funds I got that Roth IRA invested in. And for me, it's important that what I invest in, that I know the values of what I'm investing in are in line with my values. Now, I realize that that's impossible at a perfect level. But like 95% of my retirement funds, I know that they're invested with an organization that has standards about what they invest in. That's important to me, that I not gain at the expense of others' well-being or profit off things that I believe are harmful. Can any of us do that perfectly? No. But are we doing it the best we can? And thirdly, do you gain at the expense of your integrity? Does your making a living require you to lie? Okay? Do you have to lie to make a living? And here's maybe a bigger question about integrity. If what you spent were to be published in the Elmore County Reporter, this was a good guy I heard a pastor say one time, that if what you spent, the way you spent your money, if it was published in the Wetumpka Herald, and everybody could see what you spent your money on, would you be ashamed? Would you want everybody to know how you spent your money? Because this comes down to an integrated lifestyle. That's what integrity is all about. You see, ultimately, it comes down to the perspective that was stated at the beginning of this parable. The stewards, the servants, what were they entrusted with? They were entrusted with His wealth. And this is where jealousy and envy and pride are removed. Because you can't base your identity on how much wealth you have when it's not yours to begin with. You can't say, oh, I'm so great because I got all this, or I'm so bad off because I don't, when you're not basing your identity on what you have in terms of money. Because there's something else that the Master has, we're told, and that's happiness. And He is so willing to share it. So whatever you're given to do, whatever you've been entrusted with, do it with all your might. Do it the best you can. Plan, budget. Take Financial Peace University. We're offering that in one of our grow groups here coming up in a couple of weeks, 3 weeks. Invest, take risks, because it's God's money. And remembering this, remembering that your identity is not based upon it, will make you a better manager of it. And to remember that you are held accountable to how you use it. You remember you won't base your identity on it, and that you'll honor the one who has given us all that we have and will give us His happiness as well.